Hi everyone. In this clip, what we're going to be doing is starting to break down some more details, figuring out how to make sure that this looks like a bit more of a complete concept and have any of the smaller parts figured out as well. So for example, in here, we've got some basic setup and it's working pretty decent, but there's a little bit of clarity that could use some resolving. So for example, in sections like this, we could come in here with some darker values and just make sure that the clarity of these shapes is staying intact. Some little highlights here that we don't need can be resolved. Little connection points can be reinforced. If we wanted to have a bit more information going on in some sections, maybe break up or start to change certain surfaces here, we can absolutely start to do that at this stage. Start to figure out how to make things look maybe just a little bit more complicated or interesting by just breaking up some of these shapes a little bit more. And any of these parts we can kind of continue to play with. That's the real big benefit of doing some of this work. You could figure this out absolutely inside of Photoshop first, before you go into ZBrush. You could figure it out before you go into ZBrush, afterwards, at any time, basically. The main goal here is to just have a nice, simple workflow for yourself so that you can start to refine things. Whatever that is totally up to you. So let's just start to refine certain other sections in here. Let's add just an extra detail to this part. Something that's just going to embellish a few extra things, make things look kind of interesting. The whole goal here is that we're allowing ourselves to refine and still use the colors that already exist. Because sometimes it can be kind of a pain to refigure out a value structure when you're trying to work with things and figure out design. So a lot of times I like to build on top of each element so that my design is multifaceted. It can fit lots of different needs and help me understand exactly what it is that I'm trying to work with as well. So I'll understand the structure of the object that I'm trying to build out, and if another artist has to build on top of that, they will have a good grounding of information as well, because I built this off of something that is structurally sound, because I had to actually build it myself in the first place. So that's pretty good. We can start to build out some of these details. We can start to test out other things as well. If we wanted to try like putting those bolts in various spots, we can see what that would look like. That's pretty interesting. We can start to darken out those values in here. Let's try some darker shapes, just a little bit harder edged here. There we go. A couple of highlights to embellish any of these pieces. And all of those parts will give us just a richness in this design that we can work with. And we can always, of course, just start to play with the various elements in here, see how they look, see if we're adding too much in certain spots, see if we can add a little bit more into certain areas here. Any of these parts are all incredibly valuable for us to kind of fiddle with and play with. So in here, for example, I might want to just build in a couple extra structure or connection pieces. Maybe try seeing what it's like if I just incorporate that gray back in. See if that's going to start looking a little bit better through here. Maybe incorporate gray through these sections here. Just kind of see how that looks. And it starts to get a little bit overly detailed. And in this case too, I'm kind of feeling like a little bit too sci-fi. So I want to keep some of these structures just simple and not too messy or convoluted. But maybe a few connection points here just to embellish in a few details can be quite nice. Let's just kind of clean that up. There we go. And again, just reinforcing what the angle is of several of these elements by incorporating back in some of the extra highlights and things like that that we're getting in the rest of our imagery. Let's just change that up through here. And again, we can kind of really highlight certain edges just to make sure that they show up really nice and strong in the rest of this concept. That's pretty good. A lot of times it's just kind of making these adjustments, zooming out, checking how that looks, reincorporating in some of like the lighting ideas that we've been trying to get from those extra highlights off to the side. That rim light that we were starting with. Let's just kind of reinforce those color values and those darker sections here as well. And again, just kind of reinforcing these small pieces. A lot of this is just refinement, cleanup, adjustment, refinement. We want to figure out what's going to go on down here, for example, too. So this section in here could have a couple of extra pieces added on top. Let's go with some brighter values. There we go. Just start to build in some brighter highlights maybe. See how these connection points might work. In a lot of cases, if I'm not quite sure what I'm doing, I'll go and check my references again, which we can see here. So these pieces, for example, as I kind of click through and check through these various pieces, I can start to zoom in and start to wonder, like, okay, maybe my handle could utilize this kind of wrapping section. Maybe it'd be wood. But again, I can just kind of figure out which way I want to go with any of these pieces by just checking my reference. This is where I get inspiration from. So for example, this section here, the metal, has a really interesting wear and tear to it. And I could start to incorporate that into my concept. I could try to incorporate some of these design elements in here as well. So for example, through here, I can start to see what that might look like. I still want to keep things relatively hard-edged, but what would it look like if I incorporated in these kind of brighter sections? So let's start to resolve some of this. Let's do this in a new layer and try out what that design might look like. Now we could do this back in ZBrush again if we wanted to. Perfectly fine. But if we wanted to try it in here first, we can see how that would look. So let's go a little bit dark through here. A little bit of a cleanup through this section. Maybe go with something like that. And start to see what that might look like. There we go. And it's going to change up the shape in here just a little bit so that we get a couple of brighter highlights on that side. And that looks kind of weird in this case. Now, it's worth trying to see how you can resolve certain design choices like that. See if that can result in something useful or good. Sometimes you might want to start with just really big, broad brushstrokes to see if you can turn a design into something interesting. If that tapering works well, or if some larger design structures might be needed. But in most cases, these are looking not that great. So what I might want to do is just add in some of that simple structure that we were seeing in a couple of other concepts. So for example, in this case, I may just want to add like a light banding to this. Maybe it's a cloth that has just a few simple divots to it. So for example, in this case, it might just come through like this and have a couple of highlights showing up. Again, we can start to just try to figure out which way this stuff should go as we design through it. See if that kind of stippling or bumping effect works for this piece. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. In this case, I think I might want to just go with a wrapping. In this case, just a light wrap across each section here. Could bend it with the form of this a little bit more. If we wanted to change some of the highlight in here, maybe just start to remove that sharpness, we can do that. It doesn't really matter what the initial ZBrush sculpt was doing. It was hard-edged in there, but maybe it's not in here because we've just decided to have it not do that. We can absolutely do that. That option still totally remains open to us. And we can start to just resolve that through here. Do some of this wrap, a little bit of a tighter detail in here. Maybe even start to resolve another kind of layering to that wrap as well to see if that could look interesting. Extra little details through here. We can add extra shape to this as well if we want to. Just a bit of that highlight. At any point, we can start to just kind of move these structures around just a little bit so that these parts start to maybe have just a little bit more shape and form and aren't quite so hard-edged and simple. Maybe it's got a little bit of shape in here. If we see that we like something like that, that's pretty good, or we could just get rid of it again and not worry about it. But that's pretty good. We're starting to figure out what some of this basic structure might look like, and we're starting to resolve some of those details and those design elements that we maybe either couldn't resolve or figure out inside of ZBrush. We maybe wanted to try to resolve elsewhere. And we've got something that's starting to look pretty interesting. Finally, we could start to maybe add just a little bit of wear and tear to the metal itself. Maybe get some scratching across certain surfaces, some really bright values just to kind of accentuate in some of the kind of wear and tear that we might see across this kind of surface. Some dings, some cuts as well, some dark edges. I'm going to use a bit of a sharper brush for that as well, just so we keep the break in this looking really convincing. Lighter values through here. Again, because this is a sort of a big choppy object, it's really stylized, we can go with some bigger kind of cuts into the surface. A lot of the times when I'm dealing with these kind of scratches and cuts, I'm just trying to think about the directionality of it, for one, and if it's really deep cut, a couple of highlights. But I don't want to go too bright on that value scale so that the things don't look like they're too deep. They just have a little bit of a highlight to them. There we go. In some cases, just trying to figure out what the directionality is of those scratches as well. Maybe something more like this. I think this one then should look a bit more like that. I can use rotate as well to just kind of help myself get those angles right so that any scratches are going to look like they kind of fit in the proper direction. I just want these things to look nice and interesting on top of that surface and not break things up too much or become too distracting. If they start to, then I can just go with a low opacity brush and just kind of get rid of some of those designs so that they're not quite so intense on that value. There we go. Just want these to be kind of an accent to the general form here. A couple of extra highlights I think will brighten up the blade section here. I can just kind of go in here very, very lightly with this. Let's go to a low intensity and just embellish out this blade edge as well. And that'll start to look pretty interesting because then we've got some nicer highlight strokes that we can start to build in. And the surface can start to look a little bit more nuanced and interesting as well. So that's pretty good. In our next clip, we'll start doing some material callouts.